Alpha Omega, Part 3. Since ancient times, humankind has, in various times and places, tended to embrace or to be dominated by one or the other of two characteristic approaches to the apparently two dimensions of the inherently one and indivisible reality. Just so, every individual tends to be involved in a constant struggle between two primary and opposite motives that correspond to the two characteristic approaches to the apparently two dimensions of the one reality. These two approaches generally correspond to the Oriental or the Eastern and the Occidental or the Western strategies of culture, although the Oriental tendency can sometimes be found in the traditional West, as, for example, among the more mystically oriented of the ancient Greeks. And the Occidental tendency can sometimes be found in the traditional East, as, for example, among the most practically oriented of the ancient Chinese. I call these two efforts or tendencies the Alpha strategy and the Omega strategy. The Alpha strategy is based on the tendency to identify with the most prior or non-conditional and transcendental reality or condition exclusively or in a manner that suppresses or otherwise strategically excludes conditional reality. And the Omega strategy is based on the tendency to identify with conditional reality exclusively or in a manner that suppresses or otherwise strategically excludes the non-conditional or transcendental reality. The Alpha strategy exhibits control relative to conditional reality, including social relations, social and bodily action, sex and functional bodily indulgence of all kinds, expressions of emotion, and activities of mind and liberality relative to the non-conditional or divine reality. Thus, the Alpha preference is for the control or strategic limiting or minimizing of the functional and relational activities of the conditional psychophysical personality, even to the degree of suppression and exclusion, and for the maximizing of attention, mystical devotion, and meditative surrender to the transcendental divine reality, being, or person. The Alpha preference aims to lead from self-control to peace of mind, and finally to strategic escape from conditional reality and to consequent oneness with the non-conditional reality. Indeed, this Alpha strategy can be said to be the epitome or archetype of what is, in the context of the total great tradition of humankind, previous to my divine avataric appearance here, commonly conceived to be the ultimate esoteric or spiritual and transcendentalist path associated with the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth stages of life. Similarly, there is another and quite opposite strategy which Alpha strategists conceive to be the anti-esoteric path, but which Omega strategists conceive to be inevitable, truly human, and even, from a conventional religious and rather exoteric point of view, obligatory. That strategy is the Omega strategy itself. The Omega strategy exhibits liberality relative to conditional reality, including social relations, social and bodily action, sex and functional bodily indulgence of all kinds, expressions of emotion and activities of mind, and control in the form of doubt, lack of interest, and taboos of all kinds relative to the non-conditional or divine reality. Thus, the omega preference is for control, limitation, doubt, and even suppression or exclusion of attention, mystical devotion, and meditative surrender to the transcendental divine reality, being, or person, while otherwise liberally maximizing attention and the pursuit of experience and knowledge relative to functional and relational activities, and even the total conditional context or world context of bodily based human existence. This omega preference aims to lead away from vulnerable, weak, and ignorant victimization by cosmic nature and to greater and greater experiential or perceptual and abstract or conceptual knowledge, and finally to collective and individual control over cosmic nature, and thus the ability to exploit and duplicate the powers of cosmic nature. This omega strategy can be said to be the epitome or archetype of what is, in the context of the total great tradition of humankind, previous to my divine avataric appearance here, commonly conceived to be the necessary and necessarily exoteric path of human fulfillment. Indeed, it is sometimes, from a typically Occidental religious point of view, conceived to be the path of fulfillment of the divine purpose in the cosmos. Therefore, to be truly religious, from the Occidental point of view, one must relinquish much of the Oriental mystical or transcendentalist orientation and, instead, practice religion in the non-mystical and non-transcendentalist or exoteric fashion of submission to conditional effort within the conditional cosmic scheme. These two strategic points of view are apparently in conflict with one another, and indeed, historically this has been the case. That conflict is itself one of the principal conditional signs of human struggle within the context of conditional nature. Thus, early human history, and indeed the entire history of the total great tradition of humankind, previous to my divine avataric appearance here, developed on the basis of a dichotomy or split in the human disposition, based on the two natural functional divisions of the human brain and of the human nervous system. And on the basis of that split, humankind has developed along two entirely different lines, which may be compared and related to the frontal and spinal lines of the human body-mind complex, almost as if humankind were composed of two separate species. Therefore, this dichotomy and these two great lines of human development must be considered and understood. When both sides of the traditional dichotomy become conscious of one another, a profound sense of inherent, irreducible, and inevitable conflict may also appear between them. Then humankind seems to be confronted with a choice between two destinies, one oriental in its conception and the other occidental in its conception. Because of the naturally gross or persistently bodily-based survival politics of ordinary human culture, it may seem that humankind as a whole will always inevitably choose the omega or frontal and left-brained, verbal-minded or rational path, but it may also seem that humankind, one by one, must necessarily choose the alpha or spinal and right-brained, non-verbal or intuitive path, or else be destroyed by political and cultural conflicts. I was, by means of my great divine avataric descent into the totality of the cosmic domain, born in human form in a terrible moment of necessity, to call humankind to the great moment of new understanding, and to the great future of a single destiny. My avatarically self-revealed divine word, my avatarically self-revealed divine image art, my avatarically self-manifested divine revelation history, the bright divine revelation sign of my avatarically born bodily human divine form, the divine work of my avatarically self-transmitted transcendental spiritual and always blessing divine presence, and the avatarically given divine self-revelation of my perfectly subjective and very and transcendental and inherently spiritual and intrinsically egoless and inherently perfect and perfectly accursal and self-evidently divine state forever call humankind to transcend both the Alpha strategy and the Omega strategy. Neither the one nor the other should be chosen exclusively. Whether Alpha or Omega, it is the same ego or self-contraction that makes the path. The same ego turns away from conditional reality and turns toward it. The same ego turns toward God as the however conceived non-conditional reality and turns away from God via the conditional reality. The same ego believes one must turn toward God by minimizing or excluding conditional experience and knowledge, and otherwise believes one must turn away from or even proceed from God and do God's work by maximizing conditional experience and knowledge. It is simply that there are two forms of egoity, the one basically Oriental and the other basically Occidental. My avatarically self-revealed divine word, my avatarically self-revealed divine image art, my avatarically self-manifested divine revelation history, the bright divine revelation sign of my avatarically born bodily human divine form, the divine work of my avatarically self-transmitted transcendental spiritual and always blessing divine presence, and the avatarically given divine self-revelation of my perfectly subjective and very and transcendental and inherently spiritual and intrinsically egoless and inherently perfect and perfectly accursal and self-evidently divine state forever call humankind to the only way that is single, whole, and not based on egoity. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is not developed from the exclusive or dominant point of view of either the frontal line or the spinal line, or from the exclusive or dominant point of view of either the left or the right hemisphere of the brain. Rather, the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam involves and requires the whole of the human cult structure, the full circle, the resonant nervous system, the total brain, all aligned and surrendered in tacit recognition response to me, and this, most ultimately, to the degree of inherently most perfect dissolution in my avatarically self-revealed, non-conditional, transcendental, perfectly subjective, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, inherently perfect, perfectly accursal, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state, but not by means of the ego strategy and seeking method of suppression and exclusion. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is in its fullness the way of always present real God realization through ego transcending real God communion. In the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, attention to the non-conditional reality is not strategically maximized, but rather attention to the non-conditional reality is made ego-transcending and altogether right, and thus allowed to be the natural but right life disciplined and never ego-binding context of conditional existence. Therefore, if, in the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adam, real God communion is to be constant and not merely frequent, the alpha strategy of dissociative introversion, or of minimizing attention to conditional reality and maximizing attention to non-conditional reality, is not, as an exclusive effort, workable. Instead, all attention to conditional reality must be directly converted into ego-transcending participation in the non-conditional reality. Similarly, in the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adam, the omega strategy of egoic or separate and separative extroversion, or of minimizing attention to non-conditional reality and maximizing attention to conditional reality, is, as an exclusive effort, equally unworkable, since any and all involvement with conditional reality must be ego-transcending and real God realizing. Even though involvement with conditional reality is, in principle, to be naturally embraced, without prejudice, without illusion, and without fundamental disinclination. In the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adam, the egoic or separate and separative strategy of dissociative introversion and the egoic or separate and separative strategy of extroversion are both freely relinquished in the dynamic process of radical devotion to me, whole bodily or total psychophysical recognition response to me, searchless or intrinsically ego-surrendering, ego-forgetting, and ego-transcending beholding of me, and, altogether, ego-transcending conversion or turnabout of the conditional and, in due course, most fundamentally understood and intrinsically transcended self to devotional and, in due course, transcendental spiritual communion with me, and this, most ultimately, to the degree of inherent and inherently most perfect realization of my avatarically self-revealed, non-conditional, or transcendental, perfectly subjective, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, inherently perfect, perfectly accursal, and self-evidently divine self-nature, self-condition, and self-state, which is the one and only reality, truth, and real accursal God. From the conventional and necessarily egoic points of view of the alpha strategy and the omega strategy, either the non-conditional reality or the conditional reality is proposed as the only ultimately justifiable domain of human attention and activity. I say the two cannot be separated without deluding humankind and reinforcing the egoity of humankind. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adam presumes, as a working principle of practice, both the non-conditional and the conditional dimensions of reality. The two are thus in practice presumed in prior unity and dynamic association with one another, and the non-conditional or transcendental, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, perfectly accursal, and self-evidently divine reality is, clearly, the senior dimension or source condition of this dynamic pair. In the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adam, the conditional reality is proposed and rightly embraced, but in the course of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adam, the conditional reality is always surrendered and presently transcended in devotional communion with me, the avatarically self-revealed, transcendental, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, perfectly accursal, and self-evidently divine person. The conditional and the non-conditional are not to be conceived apart from one another. Recognition responsive devotion to me, always magnified and brought to conscious awareness and action, is what constantly unites the two in prior unity and dynamic association. If by means of my avatarically self-transmitted divine transcendental spiritual grace, the inherent love bliss of my avatarically self-revealed and self-evidently divine person is, in the devotionally me recognizing and devotionally to me responding manner, found, and, in the ego surrendering, ego forgetting, and ego transcending manner, embraced, in the context of the conditional worlds, rather than as merely abstract peace or object excluding selfhood, strategically dissociated from the conditional worlds. Then the body-mind self and the way become single, expressed through ego transcending and transcendently spiritually me locating and me knowing, devotional communion with me, without disinclination toward the self-sacrificial or really ego-transcending process or school of conditionally manifested existence itself. The conditional personality and the egoic body-mind self, or conditionally manifested and self-contracting being, must be converted and transcended, and not merely minimized, suppressed, or excluded in all of its forms and expressions. True real God communion is egoless, or free of self-contraction. Therefore, if real God communion is to be real, true, constant, and egoless, the way cannot be a matter of the strategic and necessarily ego-based search to minimize conditional action, experience, and knowledge. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam must be and is the process of directly converting and transcending every species of egoity, and thus all actions, every experience, and all forms of knowledge. The conventionally archetypal or alpha concept and strategy of religion, spirituality, and transcendentalism generally prefers not to act. But if action is permitted or, on some basis, even required, the alpha prescription is to act, but not to react. It is commonly understood that every action necessarily results in an equal and opposite reaction. Therefore, clearly, if one acts or yields conditional attention to conditional reality, one will inevitably react. Because of this, those who try to act and not react are always trying to control their reactions and otherwise wishing they were not moved to act. The only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam is not based on the alpha strategy or the pursuit of conditionally perfect self-purification and ultimately of the absolute suppression or negation of the conditional self or body-mind complex. Neither is the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam based on the Omega strategy or the pursuit of conditional self-perfection and ultimately of the absolute fulfillment or eternalization of the conditional self or body-mind complex. Nor is the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam characterized by any conflict between the alpha and omega principles or the strategies associated with them. I do not call my devotee to the strategy of act and not react. I call my devotee to transcend even every form of the self-contraction or the total egoic actor who acts and reacts by engaging every action as devotional and, in due course, fully technically responsible and truly ego-transcending transcendental spiritual communion with me, and not for the sake of self-fulfillment or self-negation, but only for the sake of that devotional communion itself, which is communion with me, and thus and thereby with my divine love bliss itself, infinitely self-radiant, most prior to or above and beyond all forms of self-contraction. The conventionally archetypal or alpha concept and strategy of religion, spirituality, and transcendentalism generally prefers to minimize the amount of time spent in conditional action and to maximize the amount of time spent in inward meditation. Even the ego can do this, and still there may be not even a moment of true real God communion. I call my every devotee always to transcend the self-contraction and always, on the basis of that transcending, to be in real God communion. Therefore, I call my every devotee to perform, convert, positively change, and transcend conditional actions of every kind, whether in formal meditation or, as the case may be, in the formal intensive contemplative practice of radical self-abiding, or in the everyday circumstance. For this reason, my every devotee must surely and artfully embrace right life obedience to me, and thus every discipline of the body-mind complex that turns and opens the body-mind complex to me. However, right life discipline must not be embraced for its own sake, in an ego-based and strategic seeking manner, but always by ego surrendering, ego forgetting, and ego transcending devotional recognition response to me. The conventionally archetypal or alpha concept and strategy of religion, spirituality, and transcendentalism generally emphasizes self-restraint, or the control of outward exuberance, or the minimization of the expression or depletion of the heart in relation to conditional reality. True self-restraint, or simple discipline of actions that merely indulge the body, discard the natural energies, scatter emotions, and dull the mind, is right life discipline, if applied by one who devotionally and thus tacitly understands and transcends self-contraction. True self-restraint is not the product of a problematic or negative summary view of conditional existence. True self-restraint is, for my devotee, a servant of consistent devotion to me, and thus and thereby it is an expression of tacit, true, and real self-understanding. Ultimately, true self-restraint or right life reflects real experience and true knowledge of the structural laws of the functional, practical, and relational processes of the body-mind complex. And such true self-restraint expresses a reality sense of the limits of conditional existence, or how the ego and all of conditional nature bite and bite back, and how every conditionally manifested being, thing, or process dies or disappears after a time of constant change, and how both the strategy of dissociation and the strategy of clinging always, whether immediately or eventually, result in apparently diminished happiness. True self-restraint, or the self-discipline of right life, is necessary and good for those who would realize reality itself, or truth itself, or real a causal God. But false self-restraint, generated by negative views and expressed as search, self-righteousness, and suppression of the living and feeling heart, is itself the avoidance of reality itself and truth itself, which is the only real a causal God. The obvious limits of conditional existence provide all the reasons for either false self-restraint or self-indulgence, or the excesses of either alpha or omega. In either case, the problem and the search become the logic of existence. And the reason why seeking is a false principle is that it always serves and reinforces its own original principle, which is the self-contraction. The real God-realizing process, or the process associated with most ultimate and necessarily divine enlightenment, is necessarily ego-transcending. Therefore, It is not a process in which the guiding principle is either false self-restraint or self-indulgence. Neither alpha nor omega is itself the true, primary, or central and guiding principle, even though actions in the mode of both alpha and omega may be generated on the basis of that true principle. The true, primary, or central and guiding principle is not in the strategy of dissociative detachment or separation from conditional reality, nor is it in the strategy or mere indulgence in conditional reality. Rather, in the fullness of the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, the true and intrinsically ego-transcending principle is in the free and self-surrendered acceptance, and most ultimately the inherent and inherently most perfect transcending of conditional reality or conditional existence via the discipline of ego-transcending devotional communion with me. Ultimately, true self-restraint is the right life devotional discipline of devotionally me recognizing and devotionally to me responding, and altogether ego transcending and in due course transcendentally spiritually me locating and me knowing communion with me, which finds and embraces and enters into my avatarically self-transmitted and intrinsically egoless and self-evidently divine love bliss. Therefore, ego-transcending devotional and in due course transcendently spiritually me locating and me knowing communion with me is truly ego-transcending divine love bliss itself, or perfect happiness itself. In the fullness of the only by me revealed and given reality with Adidam, the heart of true self-restraint, or the ego-transcending discipline of right life, is the true heart fullness of my graceful divine transcendental spiritual heart infusion of conditional existence and of every conditional circumstance via my mature devotees' ego-transcending devotional and transcendental spiritual communion with me. Therefore, not false self-restraint or the alter strategy of strategic dissociation or strategic separation from conditional existence, and not self-indulgence or the omega strategy of clinging to conditional existence, but ego-transcending devotional communion with me under the circumstances of conditional existence is necessarily the nature of the process in my divine avataric company. Therefore, my devotee must, from the beginning of his or her participation in the only by me revealed and given reality way of Adidam, learn and practice this devotional and right life process of ego-transcending communion with me, until, by means of my avatarically self-transmitted divine transcendental spiritual grace, the realization of my inherent and transcendental, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, and self-evidently divine love blissfulness, or heart brightness, stands motivelessly and divinely indifferent and self-radiant and inherently free of egoity or self-contraction, and inherently free of difference, and even at last, freely and inherently, but not strategically, outshining conditional existence itself. The conventionally archetypal or alpha concept and strategy of religion, spirituality, and transcendentalism generally idealizes peace of mind through the minimization of attention, emotion, and bodily action in the field of conditional events. But mere conditional peace of mind, or the experience of egoic calm, is not egoless perfect participation in the intrinsically egoless and perfectly indivisible and perfectly accursal divine and only conscious light. That is reality itself. Greater than conditional peace of mind is the transcending of mind in real God, wherein the mind is perfectly transcended, along with action, body, reactive and conditional emotion and attention. Greater than conditional peace of mind is mind yield in ecstasy to the degree of divine exaltation and divine intoxication, transparent to the divine fullness of love bliss and radiant with divine joy. In contrast to the alpha concept and strategy of religion, spirituality and transcendentalism, the omega concept and strategy of religion is concerned with bodily-based morality, not mysticism or inward meditation. The omega concept and strategy of religion is humanistic or ego-based, human-based, socially based and world-based, not mystical, not meditative, not inclined to go beyond conditional self and conditional world, but determined to achieve a great fulfillment in this world. Nevertheless, the omega concept of religion is religious, or concerned with the connection between humankind and God, or the connection between the conditional reality and the, however conceived, non-conditional reality, in the sense that God is conceived to be at the beginning, if only as ultimate cause, of the conditional cosmos, and working toward the end or perfection of the conditional cosmos. This idea about God is rooted in an idea about humankind. It is the omega idea. It is the bodily based and cosmically oriented idea that God, and thus humankind, or otherwise humankind and thus God, is causatively or creatively oriented toward conditional existence. Thus humankind, like God, is, in the omega view, to participate in, struggle with, and always persist in the discipline and the expectation of fulfillment in the context of the conditional reality. Therefore, the omega concept of humankind, whether or not it is associated with religion, is associated with humanistic or humankind serving morality, or the struggle for human survival and ultimate human victory in the conditional cosmos. Nevertheless, the moral propositions developed in omega-based societies are not consistently or even primarily associated with the omega strategy. Indeed, the alpha strategy is the typical basis for the moral injunctions associated with everyday life in both alpha-based and omega-based societies. The omega strategy is based on the motive to settle, to subdue, control, and exploit all aspects of conditional reality in cosmic nature and in humankind. The alpha strategy is based on the motive to minimize, avoid, and strategically escape all, or certainly the lower or lesser or most limited aspects and dimensions of conditional reality. Therefore, the omega strategy can possibly be the basis for the practice of active morality, or the morality of worldly heroes, political and governmental leaders, and creative persons of all kinds. But the alpha strategy is the typical basis for the everyday practice of passive or public and social morality, or the morality of virtue, duty, self-effacement, and even popular or conventional sainthood. The omega preference for the moral rather than the mystical path is founded on a basic tendency to identify with conditional and bodily based human existence, and a subsequent commitment to the success of the conditional human enterprise. The alpha preference is for the mystical path rather than the otherwise or alternatively moral path, and that preference is founded on a basic tendency to identify exclusively with transcendental or non-conditional existence and a subsequent commitment to succeed at the enterprise of minimizing, avoiding, and strategically escaping conditional human existence. Thus, the alpha preference is to rise above or otherwise dissociate from conditional nature, whereas the omega preference is to conquer or to subdue, control, and exploit conditional nature. There is a worldly, aesthetic, or anti-theistic, and otherwise or generally non-religious humanism or tradition of omega effort that seeks to establish moral propositions on the basis of collective idealism, such as the greatest good for the greatest number, and individual idealism, such as enlightened self-interest. But the omega effort is, in its largest tradition, associated with religious concepts. In that tradition, God is said to be the creator head of the conditional cosmos. Thus, the conditional cosmos is said to be the goal and the orderly effect of God. Humankind, likewise, both collectively and individually, is said to be the goal and the orderly effect of God. Thus, from this omega point of view, the moral imperative for humankind is to conform to the order or conditional cosmos of God and make the orderly and ultimate fulfillment of humankind and the conditional cosmos the goal of human life, both collectively and individually. Necessary to this omega concept of religious morality is the concept of God as creator cause, thus justifying human commitment to conditional existence, and the concept of conditional nature as religious, material, and moral order, thus justifying religious, intellectual, and moral propositions in the form of absolutes, laws, and imperatives. The omega strategy is full of absolute religious propositions said to be God-made, but in actuality humanly made, in a search for the security of absolutes in the insecure realm of conditional nature. And those absolute religious propositions are the basis for orderly systems of law relative to the intellectual descriptions of conditional nature that correspond to the current philosophical or scientific view in any historical period, and orderly systems of moral imperatives that are the basis for human social morality and social laws in any historical period.